So in this tutorial, I'm going to talk about an exercise that we can do when we're practicing improvising over a dominant seventh chord. And what we're going to do is come up with a jazz phrase that starts on each of the 12 notes on the piano. I'm going to do this over the chord of C7. And the first phrase will start on C, the root, the second one on D flat, the flattened ninth, then on D, the ninth, E flat, the sharpened ninth or flattened 10th, E, the third, and so on, until we've done all the 12 notes. Now, just a reminder what we've been talking about before in this series, that when we're improvising in a bebop style, we generally play most of the time in eighth notes, and we try and arrange the phrases so that most of the time the chord notes, the root, the third, the fifth and the seventh, fall on the downbeat. You don't have to do that all the time, of course, that would sound monotonous, but it tends to flow better when you get mainly chord notes on the downbeats. Now, a lot of the notes obviously aren't those chord notes, so we have to have solutions, ways of getting back on track when we've started on a note that's not a chord note. And great jazz educators like David Baker and Barry Harris identified a lot of things that people like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie did a lot when they started on a note that wasn't a chord note. And it is quite interesting that particularly Barry Harris and David Baker came up with a lot of the same solutions to the problem. Okay, so in the intro, the first phrase that I played started on the root, C, and this is what I played. Now, C, of course, is the root, so it's a chord note. So just to recap on chord notes, of course, we can play the bebop dominant scale, which is a mixolydian mode with one added note. So C7 is the dominant seventh in the key of F. So a mixolydian mode on C is basically an F major scale, but starting on C. So it's got the B flat in it. And the extra note that is added is B natural. So it's... Now that way, if you start on a chord note, all the other chord notes will fall on the downbeat, even if you change direction, as long as you're going by steps. So the first part of that phrase, I just played part of the bebop dominant scale. Now, we can also, from chord notes on the dominant seventh, we can play various arpeggios. You could play just the root position arpeggio. Not particularly colourful though. Three that work better are starting on the third. That takes you up to the ninth of the chord. Starting on the fifth. Now that's actually a G minor 7 arpeggio played over C7. G minor 7 is chord 2 to C7. So that works really well. And then you often resolve that to E. And you can also do an arpeggio from the 7th. Now, if you play that on its own, it's actually a B flat major 7 arpeggio. It kind of sounds, again, though, really like the G minor 7, but starting on the third. Now, in the example that I played, I got to the G, so I started to do an arpeggio. I could have gone up to F and then back to C, but I decided to come back down. Now, D is a non-chord note, and it's on the downbeat, so we need a way of getting it back on track. And this is a solution mentioned, it's the same one mentioned by Barry Harris and David Baker, and it's basically, you just put another note in between the D and the C, a chromatic passing note, and then you're back on track and you can carry on with the diminished scale. So Okay, now in the next one, we started on the flat ninth. Now, what I did there was use an arpeggio, a diminished seventh arpeggio. If you play the third, the fifth, the seventh, and then not the ninth, but the flattened ninth, we get a diminished seventh arpeggio. Now, I could have gone all the way down it, but instead, when I got to the G, I just went down the scale. And then started to do an arpeggio going back up, but didn't carry on to the ninth, just took a step backwards. So I'm now back on G on the downbeat. And then I could have carried on just going down the scale, but instead I did a little, what some people call a bebop enclosure. I'm aiming to land on the note E, the third of the chord, but I'd sort of circle around it. I go to the note above it, then the note below it in the scale, and then a chromatic passing note taking me up to the E. So don't forget the accents, that we tend to accent the notes that are at the peak of the curve. So one there, because we're coming back down. The ends of the phrase are important, by the way. Put an accent there and don't linger on it. Don't go. Okay, so the next one on the ninth, and I use the solution that I was talking about in the first example there, just put the chromatic passing note in. That took me to the seventh, and then I did an arpeggio. And then I did exactly the same little circle around the note E. So okay, the next one, the sharpened ninth, or flattened tenth you can call it. And basically I just went up to the third and then went back to the ninth, and then once again used that same solution. Passing note, chromatic passing note, and then after that, down the bebop scale. And once again, that little circle around the E. That's an absolute cliche, and it's one that you need to play a lot. You could also do it like this. Instead of going, you can go. Okay, the next one is the third, which of course is a chord note. Now, both Barry Harris and David Baker also talked about adding extra notes to the bebop scale. And this is one that's used a lot. It's when you're starting on the third, you put a little bit of a chromatic scale in there. Excuse me. So you're going from the third all the way down to the 13th in a chromatic scale. You're back on track by the time you get to C there, which is falling on beat 3. So now we're back with chord notes on the downbeats. And then once again I'm doing an arpeggio. And again, accents on that top note. Okay, now the next one is the fourth, and this is another solution that's talked about a lot, which is to syncopate the rhythm. So we're starting on F. Now, if you lingered on F, you do get quite a discord with the third of the chord. But if you do this, go. So I'm making the E a crotchet, and also when you syncopate it, accent the long note. So by doing that, by the time I get to the C, I am back with a chord note on the downbeat. That is very much a cliched bebop ending. Okay, the next one I started on the sharpened 11th, or you can call it the flattened 5th. And this time I used another solution, which is to start with a quaver rest, so that if I then go up a semitone onto G, I'm back on track straight away with the chord notes on the downbeat. And then I've done an arpeggio. Now, I played that as a triplet. So I've ended up once again on the 4th or the 11th on a downbeat, and we want to get back on track with chord notes on the downbeats. So I'm aiming to go to E. I just put a semitone below E and then back on track, use the bebop skill. And once again, that cliched ending of the phrase. The next phrase started on the 5th, which of course is a chord note, and I just did straightforward down the bebop dominant scale, and then once again, same ending there. The next one, I started on the flattened 13th, A flat. So what I did was I went up a semitone to the 13th, and then one step down, back on track. G is a chord note, which comes on the downbeat, beat 2. Arpeggio up, and then just straight down part of the bebop dominant scale. Okay then, so the next one I started on A, which is the 13th. And again, just put a passing note in. So basically it's the same solution as what I did on starting on the flattened 13th. On the flattened 13th, I went up to A and then down to G. This time I'm starting on A, so I just go to A flat and then G. And then I did more or less the same ending, except for that I reverted back to the good old bebop ending. Okay, so the next one I started on the 7th B flat, which of course is a chord note. And we could use the bebop dominant scale, either up or down. You could. I choose to use an arpeggio, and I did it with a rest and then a triplet, and then circled around the note E. One more arpeggio. So once again, remember, accent the notes at the peak of the curve. Okay, so we're on to the last one now, starting on the sharpened 7th. And what I did here was go from the sharpened 7th up to the 9th, back down a step. So I'm now back on track with a chord note C on the downbeat, down the bebop dominant scale. And then I carried on putting these extra notes in, the little bit of chromatic scale. Okay, so experiment with that. It's a really good idea to try this, making yourself start on every single note, because it really makes you think about how you can apply all these solutions. And then, of course, make some rhythmic interest by missing the odd note out or displacing them onto different beats, so that we don't have the same sort of rhythm all the time. Hope you found that useful. If you did and you haven't done so far, can you subscribe and give it a thumbs up? Thank you. See you in the next video.